In this short slideshow, I'm going to talk in a little more depth about examples of fan culture and fan activity, historically and more recently, both true fan culture outside the industry and the kind that the industry tries to encourage. So, one of the most important critics and scholars studying fan culture is Henry Jenkins, who himself is a Star Trek fan. And he famously studied fan fiction produced back in the 80s, like the video I showed you, the Wind Beneath My Wings video that I showed earlier. But also things like this picture that you're seeing here. This is an example of a bound copy of fan fiction for Star Trek that in the days before the internet would be shared through the U.S. mail or at fan conventions. And so Jenkins, studying this and writing and thinking about fan activity, uses the term textual poachers to describe fan activity. And you got to understand that actually the way he's using this term poacher is a positive one, right? Those of us that live in Texas or from Texas may have heard of poachers before. Poacher is a term that's used to describe someone who hunts on either on somebody's property that they're not supposed to, or in a time when it's not the season that you're supposed to be hunting. In other words, a poacher goes and they take something that isn't theirs that they aren't supposed to do for their own purposes. And so Jenkins uses this term textual poacher because he wants us to think about fans as being creative people who go and they aren't just copying or stealing some kind of creative material that existed before. They're creating, they're doing something new with it based on their own purposes. And that's what makes them poachers. They're going onto someone else's property, in this case an intellectual property, taking what they find valuable there and then doing something new with it. And they don't ultimately care if the person whose original property it was likes it or not. So the idea with textual poaching, again, is that you're doing what you want with it, and you can change it very dramatically. One of the things that we see in Kirk and Spock fan fiction, quite interestingly, is about a relationship between them, in a lot of the fan fiction, that is actually erotic, or homoerotic at least. And so this is a kind of extreme example of something we see more broadly. That is a transformation, transformative works that change that source material or queer it in a way. And in the case of Kirk Spock, quite literally queer that material. Or in other words, just change it and make it different from what it was before. So I referred to slash fiction and slash videos previously. I'm going to pause that. That's a video you can watch on your own, a Nine Inch Nails Kirk Spock slash video that's too loud for us to play right now. But slash fiction is called slash fiction and slash videos are called slash videos, not because they incorporate violence. They're not slasher fiction or slasher video, but because of the ways that they are named. And that is because you name two characters and a slash between them. It's a relationship between those two characters. So slash fiction are stories about imagined relationships between characters. Imagined in the sense that they are going beyond just what we see in the actual TV show itself. Fans imagine what is going on when we don't actually see them on screen. So in Kirk Spock fan fiction, like I said, there is a romantic relationship in a lot of it, which is far beyond anything you actually see in the series itself. Although in the series what you do see is a deep friendship between the two men and a closeness that doesn't exist with other, particularly female characters. So what Jenkins and other people who have looked at Kirk Spock fan fiction have seen is that, of all these people that write Kirk Spock slash fiction where there is a homosexual relationship between these two characters, these aren't written by homosexual men. These things are written by heterosexual women. And the truth of the matter is there's just a lack of substantial female characters on the show. And if you really want to explore romance in it, Kirk and Spock were the best characters to do that. So ultimately what we see here when we think about fan activity is that fan culture can really change the politics of television culture. It can change the meanings of it. You can really read it in different ways. Fan activity has the opportunity to really be transformative. Now, that gets me to our reading by Suzanne Scott on Battlestar Galactica, and Scott is a more recent fan scholar who studied with Jenkins, amongst other people. And she talks about two different models of fandom that we have now moving forward, and that we see in things like the 40-Year-Old Virgin and in the kind of ancillary materials that increasingly are available and seek to encourage fan activity. She talks about in-box versus out-of-box fandom, and I think this is a great distinction to make. And the reference here, of course, is to like toys in the box. So in-box fandom is all about curating and is all about the value of collecting and taking care of the series and its merchandise. So it's not just about the merchandise, it can also be about the episodes themselves and meticulously commenting upon and keeping track of the various things that happen in it. Versus out-of-box fandom, right? So either you keep your toy in the box or you take it out of the box, you get it dirty, and you do things with it, right? So out-of-box fandom is all about play. It's about transforming and doing stuff with that material, right? And what Scott says is that increasingly we live in an out-of-box mediascape. We as viewers and fans expect to be able to play with material that we're invested in emotionally. And the kinds of things that used to be stigmatized as fan activity as being something goofy are increasingly broadened up and made more mainstream. The idea that you would dress up as a fan dress up as a character on a TV show used to be something that, okay, maybe you do this on Halloween, right? But increasingly, of course, you're probably all familiar or have heard of cosplay. And conventions themselves are now a mainstream activity, right? And it's interesting, though, to see what remains kind of stigmatized as being overly involved often are those things which can't easily be correlated with being valuable versus collecting things that are going to accrue in monetary value. That is a kind of clear financial basis for that. It's easy to excuse. So that's something interesting to think about. What are those fan activities that are legitimized and viewed as being socially acceptable, and what isn't? Now, briefly, I'm just going to end by mentioning some things that Scott talks about in her article on Battlestar Galactica and ancillary content. She points to the various webisodes, the comics, as well as podcasts that were produced in conjunction with Battlestar Galactica, which was a fantastic series from about 10 years ago. Actually, I guess more like 15 years ago now, on the Sci-Fi Network. And if you like science fiction, if you like things like, or even things like Star Wars, I highly recommend you watch Battlestar Galactica. Not the 1970s TV show, the 2000s TV show. But what she shows is that not only do these ancillary content provide alternate revenue streams for the industry where you can sell commercials during webisodes or sell comics for people to buy, but they also tend to reinforce the narrative of the primary TV text, and they can fill in those gaps that are actually so valuable for fans to use to generate new content. So it's interesting because this ancillary content, if you're a fan, on the one hand, it's great. It means there's more stuff for you to watch, more stuff for you to engage. But on the other hand, it can kind of fill in the gaps for you and make it more difficult to have that play, that out-of-box activity that traditionally has been so important to fandom.